Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be playing Ghostmaker Infernal Shade Necromancer. So I played this build about a year ago when we got access to the multiplayer beta servers, and I dropped the unique dagger Ghostmaker, and I was instantly inspired to play a build with it. Now, of course, it's been about a year, and there's been a lot of tech, a lot of discoveries, and a lot of things that we've learned about Infernal Shade since then. Now, of course, I do know that there is a bunch of bugged setups with Infernal Shade going around and unintentional mechanics based on Infernal Shade, including like abusing sacrifice on zombies to essentially make uh, like infinite Infernal Shades. I know that that exists. I'm going to assume that that's probably going to be removed from the game eventually, as it's pretty ridiculous. Now, of course, we're going to be playing the quote unquote balanced version, quote unquote, right? So this is Infernal Shade Necromancer. Now, the whole concept of the build is to juice up our Infernal Shades as much as possible and also, clear with them. One of the biggest problems Infernal Shade has is, I'll be honest, the damage on it is pretty mediocre for the most part. Sometimes, like, you'll feel like as though you're dealing no damage, and that's just how Infernal Shade works. Now, of course, thankfully, with the way that we're currently setting it up, we have a few ways of like stopping that. The first thing is getting to a maximum of 10 Infernal Shades and 1 max Dread Shade. The idea here is we're utilizing the set here for once, right? The set that gives us 4 extra max shades. This means that we can apply as many shades as we want in the Monolith of Fate or on bosses as well, and all of that combined just leads to like a lot more damage than we normally would have access to thanks to the 10 max shades instead of just like 4, which is great, right? Now, how are we shotgunning on the same target? Well, thankfully, there's a node inside, of course, Infernal Shade called Hellfire. This node, I'll be honest, I didn't really think about it for a while. I'm surprised that I never thought about it until now. Hellfire is a node that puts Infernal Shade on cooldown, but it makes it so that it waits on the ground instead of course, attaching to an enemy, and it no longer attaches. This is kind of good for our current setup because it means that all 10 Infernal Shades that we cast on the ground can all be, of course, shotgunned on the same enemy. So we can put down 10 Infernal Shades on the enemy and they'll take more and more and more damage, which is very phenomenal for our current setup as we have Ghostmaker. Ghostmaker is really strong as it allows us to cast Infernal Shade on kill. And whenever it works with, of course, Hellfire, it actually just puts an Infernal Shade on the ground next to, I believe, either your cursor or the enemy. I'm not entirely sure. But essentially, we have a chance to cast Infernal Shade on kill whenever we put our Infernal Shade on the ground. We kill enemies, and you can see the whole screen light up sometimes, which is really fun, right? Which means not only do we have our single target fix with Ghostmaker giving us that massive 800%, I mean, I think 600% more, no, it's like 500% more damage multiplier. We're also, of course, getting the crazy chance on kill, which can clear very easily thanks to the fact that, we get one kill and all of a sudden the whole pack dies because, we get 10 shades instantly. So overall, that's fun. Now, of course, is this build that competitive? It's okay. It can do 400 corruption fine. The biggest problem with this kind of build is most necromancers defensive like setups. They're mainly focused on having minions out. So necromancers notoriously have a little bit less defenses than everyone else in the game, but that is because you have minions to essentially be your defenses, right? Like you have minions to block attacks and stuff like that, to taunt the enemy, stuff like that. So that's why Necromancer has less in general defenses than the other classes do. But we're not utilizing any of that, which means that, of course, we're going to be taking significantly more damage than your stereotypical build, meaning that we need to build over like abnormal defenses. So in this build, we're utilizing, of course, again, Vessel of Strife. Vessel of Strife allows us to turn all of our health regen into ward per second. At the recording of this video, I had about 1,000 health regen per second, and 60% of that is, of course, 600 ward per second. 600 ward per second is a lot of ward per second. It's very comparable to a lot of different builds, and it essentially allows us to build up a very nice defensive bulwark against most damage. Now, of course, we abuse things like the health regen if we've deactivated Aura of Decay recently, right? That gives us a large amount of percentage. We also, of course, get the percentage from Lagan, which is another large amount of percentage ward like per second essentially. And we also get access to the 2 Fairboar rings. Fairboar is great on builds that scale off intelligence, like for instance, our Infernal Shade scales off intelligence, which means, of course, we gain that juicy percent damage, we gain the health regen, and we gain the armor. The armor is very important because one thing I learned after playing this specific shade build is having generic DR is very important to make, of course, Vessel of Strife feel really good, because if you have that armor stacked up like I'm doing on this build technically, it means that, of course, you take less damage, which means you gain more ward per second, which is great. I also found that having chance to gain ward when hit idle seems to be very good for, in general, when you're like doing normal monolith gameplay and a bunch of the Solarian archers hit you. Oh my goodness, the Solarian archers hit you so much damage. But yeah, even with all of the damage they can get, thankfully, with Vessel of Strife, we can tank a lot of it. Now, of course, like I said, this build isn't the best build of all time. I wouldn't suggest actually playing it. This is simply a pet build of mine that I keep updated every so often because I really enjoy it. Now, with all that being said, if you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel if you want more stuff like this. You can also, of course, leave a comment down below of what kind of build you want to see next. Now, with all that being said, let's go in game and talk about the build in more detail. All right, so here we are in game with the character. First things off, I want to let you know that we are currently utilizing the numlock trick to keep Aura of Decay, of course, deactivating. That's so that we can utilize this node so we can get an insane amount of increased health regen for our build, which is great because it gives us a lot of extra health regen, which gives us a lot of extra ward per second. Now, of course, another thing I want to talk about this build is for monolith gameplay, I usually just use Transplant to teleport through stuff and, use Dread Shade, Infernal Shade, and Hungering Souls. Essentially, this is kind of a combo build. What you do is you walk up to a pack, Dread Shade, Infernal Shade, Hungering Souls, Dread Shade, Infernal Shade, Hungering Souls, and for the most part, that has done very well throughout my times playing with this build through monoliths. Now, what you can do though is when, of course, you are doing a boss, you can swap out a transplant and go for summon wraith to get the insane multiplier of more damage on a boss, because you can't get it on hit of boss with this setup, or in general. It's only on kill. So while you're in the monoliths and you're killing things, you'll get summon wraith. But then, of course, when you're on a boss, you don't actually get it. So you have to manually cast summon wraith. That is the main reason why this build is on Necromancer and not on like a Lich or something else, or eventually on Warlock, right? And that's pretty much it for things you need to know beforehand. Now, let's talk about skills, shall we? So we have Infernal Shade here. We take 2 points travel into Cackling Flames, 3 points travel into Brimstone, 1 point into Hellfire, and then 1 point into Fiend Hunter. Fiend Hunter. The idea is we're trying to put Infernal Shade on the ground so that we can stack multiple Infernal Shades on a singular target to, of course, deal enough damage to kill them. Because if you play a normal 1 Infernal Shade setup, you can only apply 1 Infernal Shade on the enemy at a time, which sucks donkey. So you definitely want to put down multiple Infernal Shades down on the ground. It also gives you free Fire Shred. I do grab 1 point in the cooldown recovery speed because it brings it from 3 seconds to 2.2, which is much more acceptable than 3 seconds. And of course, one thing that's important for this is we don't have enough duration to keep Infernal Shade up just by its lonesome, right? And that's why we utilize, of course, the node here, Infernal Dread, which refreshes Infernal Shade on cast. Now, of course, we can either cast normally or we can cast it on an enemy. Either way, it will keep it going. Thankfully, thanks to, of course, Lich's Envy, our Dread Shade costs very little mana, and with a little bit of mana regen, we can kind of just spam Dread Shade and keep our Infernal Shades up forever, thanks to, of course, this node. Now, of course, we utilize, of course, Flight of Fire, which is an additional shade, so we go up to 10 Infernal Shades in 1 Dread Shade, 2 points travel into Influence, 3 points into fanning the flame for more damage, increase area, because one of the biggest problems with this build is clear, so the more area you get, the better your clear will feel. And of course, we utilize Blaze Shade and Fleeting Shade. The idea is to make it so that every so often I'm going to walk up to a pack and Blaze Shade is going to proc, and I'm going to just delete the pack. Um, Waiting for it to proc here, 20% chance. There you go. Blaze Shade will go up and it'll delete the pack. Now, of course, it has like less of a duration, but thankfully, Dread Shade with Infernal Dread actually maintains that. It has the less duration, but you also, of course, utilize Dread Shade here to maintain the duration, which is great, right? And it does a very large amount of damage because you get 20% more here and then 150% more here, right? And of course, we take 2 points into Heart of Fire, then 3 points into Wildfires. Eventually, when you get plus levels to Infernal Shade, what you can do is kind of put more points into these. You can always mess around with the Infernal Shade tree, try to squeeze out as much damage as possible, but this seems to be the best setup for me, at least currently. And that's pretty much it for Infernal Shade. Now, let's talk about the next skill, Dread Shade. So 1 point travel into Spectral Presence, 2 points into Dying Coven. We don't need that much cast speed. 4 points into Grim Fate for the 60% more damage, 1 point into Enemy of My Enemy so we can attach it to enemies because we're not going to attach it to our minions, and then 1 point into Symbiotic Apparition so that it applies to us so we get the 60% more damage. Now, of course, we're utilizing Flesh Harvest. This gives us a large amount of buff effect for, of course, Dread Shade when our enemies are missing HP, which turns this to like 120% more and stuff like that, right? Of course, 3 out of 4 points of the Lingering Doom. This will give us more flat damage when we actually put Infernal Shade on enemies. And of course, 2 points travel into Wisdom of the Dead, although the mana efficiency is nice, as it allows us to spray Dread Shade. 1 point into Martyrdom, so we get armor per vitality. We have about 13, so that's about like 300 flat armor. This is really strong because like you can get a large amount of flat armor by casting this, which is great, right? Then 1 point into Congregation, which gives us another shade max for all of our stuff, and then 1 point in Infernal Dread, which enables the build. Without this node, this build wouldn't exist. Now, Aura of Decay, TLDR, all you care about, Respite, everything else doesn't matter. Mainly Respite for the, of course, the refresh for Aura of Decay to get that, of course, juicy health regen on deactivate. Of course, Hungering Souls, main thing we care about is Inspired Hunger for 40% more damage against targets, right? Then the 15% Coal. The 15% Coal has been really good so far, as it just feels really good, especially when you're stacking Oribus's with a bunch of Endurance, which is great. And of course, for Summon Wraiths here, we just have a utility Summon Wraiths. We have the +2 here, we have the minus mana cost here, we have Echoes Inside, which makes it so that we can cast multiple Wraiths at once. Then we get those multiple Wraiths here, so we summon 6, and then get some cooldowns. So we can summon 6 every single time we need them, which on bosses is great. Like I said, you swap between Transplant, Unspect, and then of course Summon Wraith, which is great. And that's pretty much it for skills. Now let's talk about, of course, passives that are important to the build. Mainly, you want to be grabbing as much minion health, as much health regen here, as much ward retention, right? Intelligence is great too. For Lich, Intelligence here. We also grab Hollow Lich, which gives us like 200% increased damage, which I'll show you later. Then 8 points into Bed of Souls for even more increased health regen. And of course, the Necromancer here, ward retention, like I said, getting some health regen percentage here as well. Eventually getting the health regen percentage here. This makes it so that our 8 Wraiths are giving us a decent amount of health regen and armor, which is great. And of course, 10 out of 10 for Rite of Undeath to cap some of our, of course, resistances. Then 5 points under Frantic Summons for the cast speed, because that's very important for our build to feel good. Then, of course, 5 points into River of Bones for that massive 20% of critical damage leeches health, which is then multiplied by 10 thanks to Lich, which is in 200% increased damage. It gives us a decent damage boost because we're not actually leeching from our damage. We're just utilizing, uh, health regen instead, and we're utilizing the damage for extra damage, right? And that's pretty much it for, of course, the passive tree. Now, let's talk about, of course, our gear. So, for idols, all I did was just put on a bunch of idols for resistance. That's all we really care about. For our weapons, we care about Ghostmaker, right? With cast speed's pretty good. Cast speed means that you will feel more quality of life casting things, because Infernal Shade has a very large cast time, which is annoying. And of course, we have the set Witch's Scorn and Witch's Envy. Witch's Scorn doesn't actually give us anything other than the fact it gives us some intelligence and gives us 4 extra shades. That's essentially what this gives us. Then, of course, Witch's Envy gives us a decent amount of flat, like 20 flat. I mean, like, no, it's like 34 flat, then increase area, and also minus mana cost. And of course, also gives the +4 shades, so we can get +4, go up to 10 shades, which is great. Then other items, Fairbore's Presence. I mean, Persistence is really strong for low life builds. You can look at my health regen here, right? We're at like 900 health regen. It's like 400, half of it, taking off Fairbore's. Also, as well, if you want to look at my ward retention, right? 309. It's like 469. Yeah. And of course, look at my armor as well. That's why we're running Fairbore's, if you're wondering. Fairbore's is really strong for this build, for any build utilizing Vessel. And of course, like I said, the last item, Vessel. Uh, Vessel of Strife is very important for this build because it gives us the sustain that we need to tank things, which is great. You could technically go low life with this build if you have infinite budget, but you'd be losing, of course, Shackles, which would not be very ideal. And that's pretty much it for the uniques that we need. Now for the helmet here, Intelligence, health regen, right? Amulet, spell damage, health regen, resistance, mainly cap out our resistances here. Get area of effect if you can. Then chest, health regen, damage, armor percent. This is like pretty much exactly what you want. Belt here, critical strike avoidance. I'm using it to cap my critical strike avoidance, right? And of course, health regen and mana regen. And then, of course, you could run either Ellie dot, necrotic damage, or, of course, whatever you want on the belt prefix. Then for the boots here, health regen, movement speed. Eventually, you'd want either vitality or, of course, intelligence here. I don't have that, but it's like whatever. And that's pretty much it for the items. And then, like for the idols, like I said, just resistance idols. It's literally all resistance idols. And of course, one thing I will note is we're utilizing, eventually, you'd utilize Black Sun for Void Res. Eventually, you'd use Grand Rhythm of the Tide for HP regen, Critical Strike Avoidance for Grand Minus Survival, Armor for Spirits of Fire, then Armor percentage for Age of Winter. And that's pretty much it for the build. With all that being said, this has been Dread. Make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more. That being said, this has been Dread. Off to go do something else. Bye.